Hi, good evening, good afternoon to someone in the West Coast, and good evening to the audience in the East. Welcome to our AAPI Heritage Month webinar series. My name is Wang. I'm from Civic Leadership Academy. This webinar series is presented by 4 leading organizations dedicated to advancing AAPI communities. They are Civic Leadership Academy, BRI Talks, 就是侨路基金会公益大讲堂 and United Chinese American, 也就是 UCA 美国华人联合会 and 美华历史。Every year in May, the AAPI Heritage Month, these organizations, together with other Chinese community organizations, will hold a series of webinars to celebrate the contributions of the AAPI community in US and discuss the challenges AAPI communities are facing and some other interesting topics. Today is our 3rd webinar. We are really honored to have our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Vivian Louie, to talk about ethnic equality in curriculums. Please let me introduce our speaker, Vivian. Vivian Louie is a professor of urban policy and planning and director of the Asian American Studies Center and program at Hunter College. Louie has been associate and assistant professor and postdoctoral fellow in education, as well as lecturer in sociology at Harvard, and a program officer at the William T. Grant Foundation. She has also previously worked as a newspaper journalist, journalism teacher, and youth magazine editor. Professor Vivian Louie studies what it means to be an American in public policies and discussions, civic participation and civic education, and roles of race, ethnicity, immigration, social class, and gender. She also writes about the factors that shape success along the educational pipeline among immigrants and the children of immigrants and in the workplace. Vivian Louie is the author or editor of 3 books, Compare to Excel, Immigration, Education, and Opportunity Among Chinese Americans, Keeping the Immigrant Bargain, The Costs and Rewards of Success in America, and Writing Immigration, Scholars and Journalists in Dialogue. Professor Louie earned her PhD and Master of Arts from the Yale University Department of Sociology, MA from the Stanford University Department of Communication, and AB from Harvard University in History and Literature. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Professor Vivian Louie.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Many thanks to Wen for the wonderful introduction, for onboarding me tonight, and many thanks to Wang for extending this amazing invitation, and to everyone in the audience. I am now going to put up the PowerPoint presentation. Is that okay, Wen?
Yeah, sure, please.
Okay, fantastic. Can you all see that? I'm sorry, I can't get to the toggle to do the slideshow because it's being blocked. So I'm gonna have to do it this way. Is this all right?
Yeah, it's fine. Actually the icon is, if you go to the bottom of your slides,
yes,
there's a projector icon on the right, a little bit right.
Okay.
One more, yeah, that's the one.
Perfect. You're brilliant. Okay. Thank you so much. I so appreciate it. Okay. Yeah. So we are going tonight to talk about racial equity in the curriculum. And Wen, just keep me, posted if everything is going all right with the technology or anything needs to be adjusted. Okay?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Fantastic. So I always like to begin with a roadmap. So the roadmap for tonight's conversation will be, where are we now with racial equity in the classroom? And what have I been doing in this space? Why is racial equity in the classroom so important? What could this look like? How can we work together to achieve this goal? And then I look forward to the audience Q&A portion. I really look forward to hearing and to learning from everyone. I know we're from all parts of the country, so it's going to be a really great conversation. So I wanted to start off with where we are now, with just some basic statistics, and you can see that it's from the Asian American Foundation website, and if you click on that link, you'll see it. But at the K through 12 level, 20 states have mandated the teaching of Asian American Pacific Islander, or AAPI, history in some way, and another 5 states are thinking about it. And that includes the state in which I presently reside, New York State, where New York State Senator John Liu and New York State Assembly member Grace Lee have together introduced a bill that calls for the inclusion of AAPI history in New York State's public school curriculum. But what you can see here is that these are just a few states, right? I mean, it's not every state in our nation. And what you can also see here is that only 1.6% of universities in the United States offer an Asian American Pacific Islander Studies program. I'm fortunate because I happen to be at an institution, Hunter College, which is part of the City University of New York, or CUNY for short, happens to have a really robust Asian American Studies undergraduate program, and I happen to direct it. So the Asian American Studies undergraduate program at Hunter College is now nearing its 30-year anniversary. It's the longest continuously offered program at the City University of New York. Hunter College also educates the most students in Asian American Studies within the entire City University of New York system, and we offer the most courses. So just to give you a sense, in every academic year in recent years, Asian American Studies has educated more than 1,000 students, plus several hundred more over the summer. So I direct this undergraduate program, and I also direct the Asian American Studies Center at Hunter College, which was launched in 2019 and offers public programming, research initiatives, and student engagement opportunities. You can also look at our website in Asian American Studies at Hunter College. You'll see the courses, what's being offered. And what you would see is that the offerings include courses in the social sciences, in the humanities. I'm also a lead scholar of Hidden Voices, Asian American and Pacific Islanders in the United States. And this is a social studies curriculum and resource guide from the New York City Department of Education. It's scheduled to be available in our public schools by the end of June, with a public digital version to be available in September. And Hidden Voices, what it does is it highlights the significance of key Asian American and Pacific Islander figures from the past and the present. The Hidden Voices Guide also provides essays to help teachers think about how to facilitate inclusive learning experiences that present individuals and groups that have largely been invisible in our curriculum and in our public dialogues. In my prior time at Harvard University, I also taught some of the first courses in Asian American Studies offered in the Department of Sociology at Harvard and in the Graduate School of Education there. And then finally, I'm also a researcher, and my current project focuses on Asian Americans in New York City around civic participation. So if any of you want to ask me a question about that, that's totally fine. Or if you want to participate in research. Now, why is racial equity in the classroom so important? It's important because all our histories should be known and taught. And one of the things we would learn is that our histories are intertwined. In the case of Asian American and Pacific Islander history, teaching that history is crucial to countering the anti-Asian hate that we've been living with since the pandemic, but that has also been in our nation for more than 150 years. And the discrimination as well. Teaching AAPI history is fundamental to the telling of the full American story. And you can see some citations there if you're interested. Now, what could racial equity in the classroom look like? That's what I'm going to turn to next. And I'm going to turn to that by really thinking through the key questions that anchor Asian American studies in the classroom. And these are the questions. Who counts as an American? Under what conditions? How can Americans build coalitions with one another to fight for equality for all? These questions lie at the heart of all of our undergraduate courses, for instance, at Hunter College in Asian American Studies, and they anchor the 12-credit minor that we offer. So what would we learn? What would we learn if we had racial equity in the classroom? Well, first, we would learn in the case of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, who we are. What are our demographics? And so what you can see here is that AAPIs are 24 million Americans. That's about more than 7% of the nation's population, spanning 50 ethnic groups with roots in 40 nations. You would understand that today, close to 60% of the US Asian population was born in another country. We would learn that, for example, in some cities, there's a substantial portion of the population. For example, in New York City, where I am, nearly 1 in 5 residents of New York City are Asian American. We would understand that we are the most economically divided group in the United States. That more than half of all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders aged 25 and older have a bachelor's degree or higher. We would also learn why the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Immigration Act of 1965 have been the key drivers in these demographics. The Immigration Act of 1965 reopened large-scale immigration to the United States after more than 4 decades of a closed-door policy. Not only did we have a closed-door policy, but it was also based on discriminatory national origins quotas that kept out people from Asia, but also folks from Southern, Central, and Eastern Europe. Why is the Civil Rights Act of 1965 so critical? It's critical in at least 2 ways. First, the Civil Rights Act, civil rights activists pushing for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 really pushed to reopen large-scale immigration with the Immigration Act of 1965. The civil rights activists really pushed to lift all these discriminatory national quotas that our nation had in place. So that's one reason. The second reason is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 really has reshaped the nation in which we all live today, and in which immigrants coming into the United States post-1965, the nation that they now know, live in and understand. And it's a nation in which the state, meaning the laws, are really now being deployed or being used to make sure we have equal opportunity. And that has not always been the case in the United States. So, what about the history of Asians in the United States? What would we learn there? Well, we would learn apologies, there's a picture that got truncated, but I'll talk you through it. We would learn how Asian Americans have gone from being welcomed workers to excluded peoples in the United States. So the photograph on my left-hand side is a photograph of Chinese immigrant workers who were so crucial to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, but whose efforts were largely excluded from the historical record, made invisible as if they never did anything. But in fact, they were paid the least amongst all the workers, and they did the hardest work, the most dangerous work. The image in the middle tells us about how there were calls in the United States for exclusion of the Chinese, of Chinese immigrant male workers, to exclude them from coming into the nation. How they were basically cast as being not fit to be American. And how the nation's labor unions were really behind this push to exclude them from entry. The photograph on the right, apologies again for that it's not there, is highlighting the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. We would also learn in a classroom that was oriented around racial equity, we would learn about exclusion from entry, right? How there have been national policies to exclude Americans descended from every part of Asia. It started with the Page Act of 1875, which barred the immigration of women from Asian nations, which also prohibited folks from forming families here. And this was followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, lasting until 1943. This was the first federal legislation in our nation to exclude labor migrants by national origins. We would also learn about exclusion in the United States. You know, when I teach Asian American studies and when I like to speak about it, I always highlight that it's not their story. Our story has not just been exclusion from entering the United States, but exclusion once in the United States. And when I say our story, I mean the American story, because of course, this is the American story, right? And so you can see here at various points in our nation's history, foreign-born Asians, meaning immigrants, they were not allowed to testify in court. They couldn't own land. They couldn't naturalize as US citizens. How can you be civically engaged if you do not have the right to become a naturalized US citizen? I mean, it's much harder if you don't even have that right. So alien landlords were passed in 15 Western states from 1913 till the end of World War II, barring, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship, end quote, meaning Asian immigrants, from owning or holding long-term leases on land. This was meant to prevent Asian immigrants from accumulating wealth, from becoming too comfortable in the United States, from having families. Because presumably, if you had wealth, it would help you raise your kids. It wasn't until 1943 that Chinese-born immigrants finally gained the right to naturalize as US citizens. And it wasn't until the Immigration Act of 1952 that other foreign-born Asians are finally eligible to apply for naturalized citizenship. We also saw, as I just mentioned, the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II, based on the inaccurate and misguided fear that they were spying on the United States on behalf of the nation of Japan that was our enemy at that time in World War II. A few decades later, we see the targeting of Muslims and peoples racialized as Muslim, including South Asian American Sikhs, who are not Muslim, but they were mistaken for being Muslim. We see this in the wake of 9/11 and the 2017 travel ban that President Trump issued. We see most recently the pandemic profiling of Asian Americans, most notably East Asian Americans, as the face of the coronavirus. And we see also how presidential rhetoric at that time and also the rhetoric of leading national politicians in our nation contributed to this pandemic profiling. Now, all of this, exclusion from entry to the US and exclusion once you are in the US, is not widely understood even today, even among Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So just to kind of give you a sense, again, of the historical and present day significance of this kind of curriculum and what we would learn, 2022 was the 140th anniversary of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The year 2022 was the 40th anniversary of the killing of Vincent Chen. Vincent Chen was a Chinese American in Detroit, Michigan, who was going out to celebrate his upcoming wedding. He was with friends, and he was targeted by two unemployed white auto workers who mistook him for being of Japanese descent. They were angry at the nation of Japan because at that time, Japanese automakers in Japan were outcompeting American automakers. And these people had lost their jobs. So they beat Vincent Chen to death. And they did not face severe legal penalties for that. That was a point of departure for another wave of civil rights activism in the Asian American Pacific Islander community. And of course, 2022 was the third year of pandemic profiling. So in our curriculum, we would also learn that civic participation matters, that pushing back against exclusion from entry to the US is important, that pushing back against exclusion in the US is also very important. And we would learn how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders have been doing just that for just so many decades, even when they did not have the right to become naturalized citizens. So I wanted to walk us through a couple of those examples, just so that we have a better understanding, right? So in education, Tape versus Hurley, this was a landmark court case in the California Supreme Court, in which the court found that the exclusion of a Chinese American student from public school, Tape, that was her surname, based on her ancestry was unlawful. The case effectively ruled that racial minority children were entitled to attend a public school in California. Lau versus Nichols in 1974 was another landmark case. This is a landmark Supreme Court case ruling that established the right to supplemental language instruction in our public schools for students who are English language learners. That they should not be penalized because they come from families in which English is not the first language. We also have some cases around citizenship. When I see that Victor Liu raised a hand, I don't know if everything is okay. Should I pause for a second?
No, it's fine.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay, fantastic. So I want to talk about a few landmark cases and examples around citizenship in the United States. So the first is the Supreme Court ruling United States versus Wang of 1898. Wang was a Chinese American. He was born in the United States, and he went to he went to China to visit family, and he was coming back to the US, and he was detained on the basis of the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. His lawyers argued that since he was born in the United States, Wang was a US citizen. And the US Supreme Court upheld his right of birthright citizenship based on the rights granted in the 14th Amendment. We have another case, United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind of 1923. In this case, Thind's lawyers basically argued that Thind, a Punjabi and a follower of the Sikh religion, was classified or should be classified in the US as Caucasian. And Thind's lawyers basically argued that Indians were scientifically classified as Caucasians. But the Supreme Court ruled that he in fact was ineligible for American citizenship. It rescinded citizenship that he had gained in lower courts. And basically this kind of opened the door for ineligibility for citizenship to Koreans, Thais, Vietnamese, Indonesians, and other peoples of Asian countries, naturalized citizenship. The other thing I wanted to talk about around citizenship is the phenomenon of paper sons and daughters from 1906 to 1943. I don't know if many of us are familiar with that, so that's why I wanted to just discuss it, bring it to the table. And this refers to Chinese immigrants who developed a business and immigration strategy of using falsified birth certificates to enter the nation of the United States. The 1906 is a critical date because this was the earthquake in San Francisco, followed by a catastrophic fire that destroyed the city's birth certificates. So this is how this practice was allowed to come into being. And what these immigrants did was they used this to circumvent the Chinese Exclusion Act, right, which suspended immigration of all Chinese workers, skilled, unskilled, and barred workers already in the US from bringing over their wives. So by using these falsified birth certificates, people could claim to be the sons and daughters of US-born folk in the US. They were the nation's first undocumented immigrants. The other case that I wanted to highlight here is Korematsu versus the United States from 1944, another landmark Supreme Court ruling, which upheld the federal government's decision to incarcerate Japanese immigrants who were then, of course, ineligible for citizenship, and Japanese American citizens, the US-born children or adults, during World War II via Executive Order 9066. And then the final item on this slide has to do with anti-Asian hate in recent years and the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act of 2021. This legislation, landmark legislation, was introduced by Representative Grace Meng, a Democrat from New York, and Senator Mazi Horano, a Democrat from Hawaii. And what it did was it aims to make the reporting of hate crimes more accessible at the local and state levels by boosting public outreach and ensuring reporting resources are available online in multiple languages. It also directs the Department of Justice to basically designate a point person to expedite the review of hate crimes related to COVID-19. And it also authorized grants to state and local governments to conduct crime reduction programs, to prevent hate crimes, and to respond to them. Now, I know I've put a lot out here, so I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point. But I wanted to, the goal of this slide as well is to really highlight to all of us how there has been quite a lot of pushback against exclusion through civic participation in the United States. Now, I also wanted to bring into the story of racial equity in the curriculum, how critical it is to have racial equity efforts, racial equity organizing. And I'm going to do that by just using the example of Asian American Studies at Hunter College, how it came into being, right? It came into being in 1971 with a single course that was taught out of Chinese classics by a geography professor. He went by his initials, the late C.T. Wu. Professor C.T. Wu actually had strong connections to Manhattan's Chinatown, to working class Chinese immigrant folk, even though he came from a background that was very, very different. He came as an international student to the United States. But he was very well aware of the discrimination that Chinese Americans faced. He wrote a book about it entitled Chink, using that racially derogatory word to highlight the experiences of exclusion against Chinese Americans. Another thing that I wanted to highlight was that, student activism was crucial to the origins of that course and to the course then being offered again. Another thing to highlight was the critical role of the Black and Puerto Rican Studies Department in actually supporting, funding, and scheduling that course at Hunter College. If any of you have taught before at an institution of higher education, you would know how important it is to do that, right? You need to fund the course, meaning fund someone to teach it, particularly if the person teaching it is a part-time faculty member. You need to have staff support to work to schedule the course in the overall class, course schedule for the college, find a classroom. And I wanted to highlight in particular the instrumental role of the late Dr. John Henrik Clark. He was the longtime chair of the Black and Puerto Rican Studies Department. That's what it was known as then. It's now known as the Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies Department at Hunter. I also wanted to highlight the critical support of Dr. Tilden Lamel, who was also chair of that same department and who later served as Hunter's provost and vice president of academic affairs, and later as acting president. I want to highlight all of that because the origins of Asian American studies at Hunter College and actually at a lot of places in our nation speak to the racial and ethnic coalition building that we need today more than ever. I also want to highlight the critical support of Dr. Shirley Hune, to push for Asian American studies, but particularly when she became associate provost here at Hunter. Oftentimes it takes someone from inside the ranks of senior administration to really support these pushes, to have Asian American studies, racial and ethnic studies to be actually institutionalized. And then the late Peter Kwong, who launched the program in 1993 when he came to Hunter. And then I also wanted to give a shout out to my fantastic colleagues, Dr. Lynn On, who is at Hunter, and history educators, Rochelle Kwan and Luigi Villanueva. And together we worked with a team of 13 undergraduate students, most of whom have since graduated, but we worked on the Hunter College Asian American Studies Oral History Project. And that's how we discovered a lot of this key, history of Asian American studies at Hunter, through audio recorded interviews with more than 20 Asian American leaders who were instrumental in the long road to 1993. They included alumni, past and present faculty, and past and present administrators. And now I want to bring into the story what we can actually do, right? I often get asked about this. Well, what can we do, Vivian, to actually push for racial equity in the classroom? And there are lots of things that you can do. There's an organization called Make Us Visible. It's a national organization with local chapters of people. When you join a group of folk who really are trying to bring Asian American and Pacific Islander history into the curriculum, particularly at the K through 12 levels. I wrote 2 pieces if you happen to be in New York City, but I also think that even if you aren't, the pieces are transferable to other locations. So in one piece, I argue, this is in a report that's issued by the Center for Urban Future. Number 224, that's the idea number, because there are 250 ideas that were shared. So if you're interested in mine, look at number 224. And it's basically that we need to expand ethnic studies educational programming, right? That we need to have more of racial and ethnic studies in educational institutions, but also in public libraries. I mean, there's so many places where this key information should be shared and can be learned. And the second and these are really small pieces, they're like a paragraph long. The second piece that I wrote is number 223, which is basically how we can leverage the city's nonprofit sector, meaning New York City, to spur interracial and ethnic dialogue. And what I argue here is that New York City has so many vibrant community-based nonprofits, but I imagine it's not only the case in New York City, right? This is the case in a lot of different locations, but just looking at New York City, we have so many, but they do not necessarily interact with one another, particularly across different zip codes. So in a way, we have a missed opportunity to have these nonprofits that should receive funding to actually have dialogues, to share their histories, the contributions, and the daily experiences of folks in their communities today, to have dialogues around that with one another. The other thing that I wanted to highlight is that, you could also have events, at your, if you have children, at your children's PTAs, parent-teacher associations, right? I'm sure they have events. You could pitch it and say, we want a particular event where we can have a guest speaker, dialogue about certain types of issues, including racial equity in the classroom. And that would perhaps also help your child's school think through ways in which they can have more enhanced racial equity in their own curriculum, in their own student activities, in their own professional activities for teachers and administrators in that school. Another way is in the workplace, right? You can, if your workplace has an affinity group, you can start one, you can join one, and you can pitch these ideas, right? Because this is where we live our lives. We live our lives, supporting our children in the public schools or private schools that they attend. We live our lives in the workplace. We live our lives, taking our children to the public libraries or going to the public libraries themselves. We live our lives volunteering at and going to events at community-based nonprofits. Okay, and so I also wanted to say that if you're interested, you can join us at Hunter's Asian American Studies. We do public programming, as I mentioned earlier. If you click on these sites, you can basically see some recorded public events that we had. You can also see, as I shared earlier in this webinar, some of the courses that we offer to undergraduates, but it can maybe spur your thinking about what courses you would want your local public schools perhaps to have, or even your local institution of higher education. 2 events that we had that were recorded in which you might be interested is one on anti-Asian hate in the pandemic age, curing the virus of hate, and one on Asian American politics today, where we are and paths forward. We have another event on June 1st that's coming up about what we should know about the Asian American experience, including, of course, efforts within the curriculum. So if you're interested in that, I'll send the information to Qian and Wen, and hopefully they can publicly share it with all of you and your fellow members. And you can also, of course, reach out to me. You see my email address there. And then in case you're interested, these are some of the books that Wen was so gracious to mention. Compelled to Excel and Keeping the Immigrant Bargain. Compelled to Excel was based on my dissertation. Keeping the Immigrant Bargain was a later work, but they both focused on the adult children of immigrants. In Compelled to Excel, it was the children of Chinese immigrants. In Keeping the Immigrant Bargain, it was the children of Dominican immigrants in the US and Colombian immigrants. And both books talk about the immigrant journeys and also included interviews with some of the immigrant parents. And both books also highlight why we need racial equity in the classroom, why we all need to see ourselves in the curriculum and what we would learn. And then also Writing Immigration is another book, as Wen mentioned, that I co-edited and contributed to, Scholars and Journalists in Dialogue, which is also, I think, would be of interest in terms of what we need to know about immigration and what we would need to learn in the classroom setting or in other settings where learning occurs. And then finally, if you have additional, if you're wanting additional resources, this again, Hidden Voices, Asian American and Pacific Islanders in the United States. The digital version will be publicly available in September of 2023. I was a lead scholar on that effort along with some wonderful folks. My Hunter College colleagues, Dr. Lynn Ahn, Chris Kwok, Dr. Kathleen Goulding, as well as Khyati Joshi at Fairleigh Dickinson University, and then Frida Lin, who is part of the URI project. And great folks, and a lot of other great scholars from all over the country, a wonderful New York City Department of Education team. And then there's some other additional resources that are available if you're interested in those specific topics. Okay, and then I'm going to stop my share and I'm back. And I wanted to just offer again my gratitude to everyone for listening to me, for joining us tonight, and to Qian and to Wen for the kind invitation and for onboarding me tonight. So if there are questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Louie. And for the audience, if you have any questions, you can put it in the Q&A using the Zoom webinar Q&A, or you can put your comments or questions in the chat. Yeah, Professor Vivian will answer all these questions. Vivian, thank you so much for your talk. You actually lead us browsing through the history of Asian American in US, from the Chinese Exclusion Act, Vincent Chen case, and a lot of things, and recently the anti-Asian hate. So even AAPI population is growing in US, but still we are minorities, and we are the easy target of those hate crimes. And so we need to change this, and education, like AAPI history is part of the US history. We need to push them into the history, into the curriculum. Yeah, so
I had someone asked if I could just show the books for Well, is that okay?
Yeah, sure, you can.
I mean, I can do that. Let me just get back to the chat.
Yeah, I guess the other thing usually the audience will ask is, could you share the the PowerPoint with us? Or
yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I will do that after the fact. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. Oop, okay. So this is one of them, Writing Immigration, Scholars and Journalists in Dialogue. I'll just pause for 2 seconds in case someone wants to take a picture or what have you. And then these are the first 2 that I mentioned, Compelled to Excel. It's published by Stanford University Press, 2004. And then Keeping the Immigrant Bargain, published by the Russell Sage Foundation in 2012. And yes, I'm going to share the PowerPoint after the fact so that you can, I think you can also include it, right, in the, or you'll do your magic, okay?
Yeah. So yeah, just ask answer the audience question. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll post the link later on once it's uploaded to the YouTube channel. And we also have your emails since you have registered for the webinars, so we can email all the information, including Professor's contact information to you all. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, so happy to answer questions. Oh, sorry. Happy to answer questions.
Yeah. I see this one. Okay, there's one question from the audience. What was the fundamental reason from psychology and sociology perspective of Asian exclusion moves?
Oh, it's a great question. Sure. So I mean, where does one start? Well, okay, so I'm trained as a sociologist, so let me just take it from there, right? So, you know, the move to exclude from entry, from coming into the United States, what I always like to say is a key difference between the move to exclude Asian immigrants from coming into the US compared to Southern, Central, and Eastern European immigrants from coming into the US, right? I mean, there are parallels to those 2 stories, okay? Southern, Central, and Eastern Europeans typically did not speak English, also came from working class immigrant backgrounds, you know, in the 19th century into the early decades of the 20th century. And they were also, came from different religious backgrounds. Southern, Central, and Eastern European immigrants were typically Catholic, entering a largely Protestant country at that time, or they were Jewish, entering, you know, a Protestant Christian nation, okay? So while there are parallels in terms of being seen, all of these folks as being seen as incapable of ever becoming authentically American along the lines of, you know, racialization, religion, you know, language, those types of things, right? So those are shared in common. But what I always like to highlight, because it's important for us to understand, is that the move to exclude Asian immigrants from the United States occurred so much earlier, right? 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, and when their numbers were so much smaller. And that's important because what that signals is how much of a threat Chinese immigrants, let's say, right, but also other Asian immigrants, but let's start with the Chinese because they were the first to be excluded, how much of a threat that they were seen. Part of this was a threat to working class white labor, right, workers. It's not an accident that the movement to exclude, you know, immigration from China started with, or really took fierce form with American labor unions. I mean, that's a part of the history also that we need to know, right? Of course, labor unions are different today, right? But back in those days, they were pretty much anti-Asian immigrants because out of the fear that employers, right, big business or small business in the United States, white employers would hire Chinese immigrant workers because the employers could pay them less.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's really what it came down to. But then that combined with all the other, right? I mean, it's hard to disentangle which comes first, right? The fears of Asians from all corners of the world as being a threat, right? I mean, that definitely, existed. The whole idea of, Asians in Asia as the quote unquote yellow peril,
mm-hmm.
right, had its origins in a lot of different areas, but one origin of that was European colonialism. It was used to justify early European colonialism in Asia, right? We're going to come in and take over and, bring our religion, our democracy, our values to these countries, to these nations of people who really, should be doing what we're doing, right? I mean, the European colonizers. That was one thing. And then the second thing is, Japan at one point was, this is in the late 19th century, right? Right before 1900, was becoming ascendant as a military power.
Mm-hmm.
So there were fears about that amongst European nations.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's makes sense. But you mentioned like the religion factors. So sometimes the culture factors. And I think the other thing probably since they were still like in a small percentage of the population, right? And so they like the discriminative acts on them has no consequences or little consequence to those politicians or legalize those the policymakers, right? So the Asian or the Chinese at that time was an easy target, right?
Yes, I mean, so I'm glad you brought that up because I forgot to mention some key statistics that I typically mention in answer to that question. So thank you for bringing me back around to that. It's estimated that there are only about 100,000 Chinese in America at the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and about 75,000 Japanese in America at the time that the move to exclude them through national policy occurred. But that there were 13.5 million Southern, Central, and Eastern European immigrants in the United States in 1924, when the door was finally shut, well, not only to them, but to so many folks across the board. So that gives you a sense of the dimension.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Our next question from JY. Thanks for the presentation. Can you comment on the background that triggered or helped influence in the incorporation of AAPI equity in education among different states? I assume that these states incorporate equity education at different times and so likely had different contexts.
Yes, so I mean, it's like Illinois, for example, was one of the first, may have been the first, right? I mean, there are different contexts in the sense of how policymakers and activists, how activists are able to get it through, right? In terms of having it be, be on the books. But the second thing that we should be mindful of is that even if something is on the books, doesn't mean that there's funding for it. Doesn't mean that it's going to be robustly implemented. And that's something that I know from activists who work in that space, right? So that's a second challenge. I mean, one is to have a mandate, right? Whether it's for Asian American Pacific Islander history and contributions on its own, or embedded in a larger ethnic studies curriculum. That's also been occurring as well. But then the second part of it is, okay, so now it's a mandate, but how are we actually going to do the work, right?
Right, implementation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do you have data that how many states have mandate?
Yeah, in the beginning of the slide, right? 20 states at the K through 12 level have mandated the teaching of AAP high history in some way, right? Of course, there's variability, and about another 5 states are considering this. And that's from the report or the work of the Asian American Foundation. And when I send you the PowerPoint, it'll be there. Yeah.
So still less than half of the states.
Oh my gosh, yes. A lot less than half.
Yeah. And you said if it's mandated, then that means the government has funding to support those.
Well, see, that's the thing. Okay. I mean, we would all think that that would be the case. But if you speak to folks who actually do work in this space, right, that's not actually the case. Yeah, I mean, you can have something that is mandated, but then, the second, the related task then becomes, well, who's going to do it and how are we going to fund it, right? When are we going to do it?
Right.
What's the rollout going to look like?
Yeah. Okay. One question from the audience. What should the Asian parents and grandparents to strengthen our children and grandkids regarding how to prepare themselves to grow up in the US, where it has seemed to be more and more divided as we enter the post-COVID.
What a great question. Yeah. Oh, what a great question. Oh my goodness. Well, there's so many things that parents and grandparents can do. I'm just going to talk about a few of them, but maybe folks in the audience are actually doing cool stuff and might want to share, right? I mean, one thing is trying to ensure in ways that you can through volunteering at the schools that your children or grandchildren attend, that you want this kind of curriculum being offered in the education that your children or grandchildren receive. Educators are not going to know this unless they hear from you, right? There is power in numbers. So if there's a parent-teacher association, which of course also includes grandparents and all kinds of family members, besides parents, you might join, right, and become active in that. Another way is to buy books for your children or grandchildren on your own, right? And that's so crucial, to develop your own reading list for them. And maybe you can read the books too. I think that would be cool. And then again, public libraries are a terrific resource. They often have, story hour or public talks at your public library. You can make a pitch to the library staff. Can we do an event around, a particular topic, a particular book, right? Now, I'm just gonna be honest with you, right? they're going to also maybe your pitch would be strengthened if you volunteer, if you offer to help out, you know, to organizing it, advertising it, that type of thing. Yeah, I mean, you know, community nonprofits are so great. And also being careful and about the kinds of news content that you expose yourselves to and to your children and grandchildren. You know, I often get the reverse question, if I may. So one of my great students in a class that I taught in Asian American Studies at Hunter, you know, she asked, or this student asked, or said, you know, I'm the child and grandchild of immigrants, and they're working class immigrants. They work so hard, and they get their news from the social media.
Okay.
And the social media really presents, you know, life in the United States in such a racially, ethnically divided, really, you know, way. And then also, you know, I'm adopting the student's voice. We live in a neighborhood that's mostly Chinese immigrants. So what can I do? The student was saying. So I think that's also you know, it's on the minds. So having these conversations too with your children and grandchildren are cool. Oh, great, sorry. Excuse my language.
Yeah. You mentioned like volunteering for PTAs. PTA actually has a strong power on the education, right? K-12 education. So that's definitely a very good approach. You talk about like AAPI's books or history contents. I know like Meihua List, one of the organizers, like Wang, they are actually writing a lot of stories, books, on Chinese American history. And actually, the other thing you can do is you can buy AAPI related books and donate it to the local library.
That's actually a great idea, Wang. Yeah. That way, you just make it easy, right? And you think about that, right? They don't even have to spend the funds. It's great for their budget. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, now it's a good question. One question from Simon In. AAPI is a construct including a great variety of ethnicities. How can different Asian ethnicities work together?
That's such a great question. Yeah. Thank you so much for raising it as well. Yeah. I mean, I think that first it's understanding our wider histories together, right? I mean, I always bring up that it is a construct, and it brings together Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders from so many, right? What did I say? 50 ethnic groups, roots in 40 nations. And yet, what is a key unifying theme is the exclusion from the US and exclusion in the US. And we just don't know about it. I mean, that's, I think, a key starting point to understand. That's why I was bringing up the parallels between the incarceration of Japanese immigrants who could not naturalize for citizenship, remember, at that point during the 1940s, and their US-born children during World War II in the US. And the parallels to that and the civil rights violations that occurred to the racialized and religious profiling of Muslims, right? And folks mistaken for being Muslim in the United States in the wake of 9/11.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. One audience already responded. She said she will buy your book and donate to a local library.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It doesn't have to be my book, but I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Okay. One question from Jim Tai, the audience. American K-12 school districts have discretionary power to teach even if the state level mandate is present. or isn't present. So which way may be used to move forward the local school districts to do this?
Yeah, it's another great question. I mean, I think that you should do what really motivates you, right? You're absolutely right. In New York City, for example, and of course, I happen to live in a city with a very large school district, public school district, right? There's also been a grassroots parental parents drive, right? Signing of a petition, I believe more than 2,500 folks have signed. They might not even be, they might not even all have children in, of school-age children, but pushing New York City, the district, to require this kind of education in their schools. It needs to occur at all levels, right? I mean, perhaps I'm not saying you should do everything at all levels, right? But all of us collectively, needs to be work done.
Yeah. So one comment from Ling Yuan, the audience, said, she responded that as a teacher educator, she has been teaching and empowering teachers to use culturally relevant curriculum materials in their teaching. That's great. That's just as you said, right? Everyone do his part, his or her part.
It's so critical. I mean, if I may share a personal story, that's how I became really academically inclined. Right, I wasn't that academically inclined in my early years of schooling as a young child. But one of my teachers, a white teacher, must have chosen a book from a list of culturally relevant books, and it was Tales of a Chinese Grandmother, folk tales. The book, and she gave it to me, and I read it, and it just clicked.
Yeah. Okay, there's no new questions right now. So you mentioned the K-12. What about colleges? Last time you mentioned about college, right?
Yes, colleges and universities. I mean, that's another place. It's shocking, right? How few institutions of higher education, colleges and universities offer an Asian American Pacific Islander program. No, it doesn't have to be. Of course, it's great to have a program. I mean, I direct a program. It's great to have a major. It's great to be a department, right? All those things would be great, but we're going into higher and higher levels, right? Of academic imprint, if you will. But you can also have Asian American studies related curriculum, meaning content, in other classes. That's another way of going about it. I actually think we should do both at the same time, right? You should have an undergraduate program or a major or a department offering that content. But not everybody's going to be able to take a course, whether it's offered in a program, a major, or a department. So if you embed that kind of the content that we've just all been talking about, right, that was in the PowerPoint as well, in other courses, in history, right, in sociology, in English, right, in the humanities, Asian American literature, Asian American memoir, Asian American films. If you embed that kind of content in other courses, then your reach expands within the institution of higher education because you reach more students.
Right. I often hear the questions from teachers or the professors. You mentioned that we need to have those API related contents, right? Who are going to generate those contents? You know what I mean? A lot of people, educators or scholars are like studying the so-called mainstream histories, right? actually, I think fewer scholars are working on studying doing research on the AAPI history. How can we improve that?
So do you mean how can we increase scholarship in the areas?
I mean, like we need contents to educate.
That's right.
Right. So where do we get those contents?
I see. Yeah. I understand. Mm-hmm. So, again, I'm going to share, my answer to that takes at least two forms. Mm-hmm. One form is a personal story that I will share because of my age and also where I grew up and went to school. None of my institutions had anything related to Asian American studies or ethnic studies.
Right.
So where did I learn this content? I learned this content, for example, as a student by doing my final paper. If they offered me in a history class, in my American history class, they said, for your final research paper, you can choose any topic you want. And I chose the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Okay.
Right. And so I did research on that. Even when I was a graduate student, if I was ever offered an opportunity to do a final paper of a topic of my own choosing, I would choose something related to racial and ethnic studies, to Asian Americans, right, as a population. And so I think that, I bring that story up because it's also kind of our responsibility, whether we're teachers or not, but just as individuals, to learn that history and to figure out who's writing, who's doing what, and let me, explore that further. But certainly for educators to get the content, there are various avenues, like I said, the Hidden Voices project on which I've been working, or been a part of. They're having their digital version that will be available in September.
Okay.
It's like 400 pages, so I think there's a lot of content there.
Okay.
For everybody. And so you don't have to read all 400 pages, but I think there's a lot of robust content. I think there's an organization, the Asian American Education Project, that offers some content as well. This oral history project that I mentioned earlier, the Asian American Studies oral history project of Hunter College. We're going to work over this summer, fingers crossed, to post it on a public website where people can access it. And I think that it's, and also I'm trying to get the good word out to colleagues I have at Hunter College about how they can use these interviews, which also have some narrative components. So meaning text, has some text attached to it, right? To actually develop content in their courses, right? Courses that they might teach, for example, in social work. It's already been used in a creative writing class that's offered at my institution, right? There are just so many diverse ways to do it. But the most important thing is to have some content, right? And then the content can then be tailored for learning purposes.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, the reason I asked that question is, in the Bay Area, we have an organization who did some history discovery tour to tour those rail worker, the railway side, and we through those tours we actually found out that a lot of stories we never heard of before, right? So those stories or those contents, how well, if in the K-12 schools the teachers want to teach the AAPI history, they need to have contents to teach, right? So
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the Hidden Voices volume We'll also offer, as I mentioned earlier, some teaching tools as well. So that probably would be quite useful as well. But I think one of the members said there is quite a lot of content being generated by nonprofit groups. And I agree with that. I'm in agreement with that. I think what it is also is to have a clearinghouse, right? So that we don't have to individually go out and try to locate the materials.
Okay. So you mentioned the Hidden Voices. They have a 400-page material published soon, right? In September.
Yes, it's going to be made available in hard copy in New York City public schools by the end of June. But then there's going to be a digital version, which I think is just easier for people to access in September. You know, when school starts again, right? Because we start in September in New York City.
Yeah. So I guess we encourage those audience, parents and grandparents to recommend this content to your local schools, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll try to remember after to put a little thing on my calendar when it comes out to email you and Chen so that you can put out the good word to your network, right? But yeah, absolutely. And I also wanted to say in reference to what you shared, Wang, which was so cool, which is so great, excuse me, about you know, these tours and Chinese immigrant railroad workers. Absolutely. You know, the late Corky Lee, who was the acclaimed photographer and activist of Asian American life. And that was his life's mission, to bring Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders into you know, the photographic record, to bringing them back into the photographic record.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
Yeah.
Okay, I know it's late for you. It's already very late in your time zone. I guess we call it the end for this webinar. We still have the last webinar in the next Saturday, talking about the creativity for the next generation. You can use the same link to log on to the Zoom. And once again, thank you so much, Professor Louie. Thank you for your very informative talk and discussion, and all the great answers to our great questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everyone. With gratitude, I'm so glad to have been invited to join you tonight, and to really, I know that you're all doing amazing things. You've got to be, because, you know, why else would you spend a Saturday night listening to me, right? I mean, that this is part of your everyday work. So thank you so much. Take care. Have a great one. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you to our audience and our supporters. Thank you so much. We'll see you in the next webinar.